good afternoon to our UK listeners, and good morning to our listeners in Canada. We have with us today the Right Honourable Mike Lake, a Canadian Member of Parliament for Edmonton and Wetaskiwin. It's a pleasure to have you on the platform today. How are you, Mike? And I suppose it's best to start with what's the status like in Canada?
You know, it's we've got some challenges here. We're a little bit behind a lot of the world in terms of vaccinations. We're our government's trying to catch up, but we didn't have them in January and February when other countries were vaccinating at higher levels, and we're in a bit of a third wave right now. Hoping that we can get on top of it, and with spring here now in Canada, it makes it a little bit easier for people to get outside, which is a good thing for mental health and everything else if we're still trying to maintain distance. But hopefully we get on top of it and can enjoy a good summer.
We'll definitely go into COVID-19 and Canada a bit later on, but it's worth letting our viewers know that Mike's actually already been on our CFOC platform before. He made his debut a few weeks ago at our Girls Education launch event. Our parliamentary chair, Helen Grant, has been tasked with a job by our government to get 40 million more girls into education across the globe. So this event is now actually available on all of our streaming platforms. Now, Mike, you are on the executive committee for the International Parliamentary Network for Education. What's that organization about?
Yeah, so it's dealing with the Sustainable Development Goals and really dealing with the challenges of education in the developing world. The fact that there are tens of millions of kids, school age kids, even primary school age kids who are not in school in many parts of the world. Of course, this is even increased during COVID and become more of a challenge during COVID. Predominantly or a higher number of those are girls. People with disabilities are oftentimes, particularly developmental disabilities, invisible in the school system. And so there's two big organizations globally that work on these issues: the Global Partnership for Education and Education Cannot Wait. And those organizations, Education Cannot Wait, actually provided funding for a network of parliamentarians from around the world who are focused on this issue. And now I think we're approaching 300 parliamentarians from all parts of the globe focused on fixing this issue, working with governments, working with each other. And I think that's the power of this, is the network of parliamentarians from the developed world and the developing world working together on the challenges. And so it's a pretty exciting initiative, looking to increase our numbers even more.
What kind of impact has COVID-19 had on education across the globe? Is there something that you've noticed in particular, trend-wise?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think that the challenge, of course, is in my part of the world, in Canada, we're facing challenges with kids having to learn remotely at times in school, at times out of school. But we have the ability to learn remotely, and when kids are in school, we have the resources to make sure that they're safely distanced and working safe in safe environments. You could imagine that in other countries it might be more difficult, and then you take it even further to like a conflict zone or somewhere like a refugee camp where it would be really, really difficult. And they're already dealing with issues around food insecurity as well. In fact, our next IPNED meeting is where we bring parliamentarians together on Zoom to have these conversations, is going to be with David Beasley from the World Food Program, who's going to be talking about that. And of course, the World Food Program just won the Nobel Peace Prize for their work in 2020. Such important work, and there's of course a real intersection between food and ability of kids to learn.
With this education role, it obviously entails more than just girls' education. You lightly touched on it there in terms of disabilities and other people with sort of learning difficulties. I think that's probably a good point to mention about autism. It is Autism Awareness Month this month, and you have a great understanding and have been a a global advocate on autism. Not only that, you also have a personal experience in the effects of autism with your son, Jaden. I suppose it would be a great point to share the clip of you and Jaden, which went viral pretty recently.
Yeah, it's from a few years ago, and it's actually just filmed on my daughter's iPhone on the couch behind me. I will
All right.
I'll share my screen, but this is a song that I've sung to Jaden since he was a little kid. He's 25 now, but when he was little, here, let me just make sure I'm sharing the right screen. There we go. Jump over to there. Can you see the proper screen now?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So when he was a little boy, I used to work for the Edmonton Oilers. So I was gone a lot in the evenings at hockey games for work. And then as a member of Parliament, I traveled a lot. And so I'd sing this song, and you might not pick up the words, but the words to the song go, "Think of me every day, hold tight to what I say, and I'll be close to you even from far away. Know that wherever you are, it is never too far. When you think of me, I'll be with you." And so I would sing this song to him. And just recently, he's started to sing back when people are singing. So this is Jaden. And when we shared it, it went to about 1.5 million views. I think it's, here we go.
Oh, wow.
Here, ready? Look at my eyes. Look at my eyes. Okay. Think of me every day, and I'll be close to you even from far away. Know that wherever you are, it is never too far. When you think of me, I'll be with you. Good job. That was nice.
And before I switch back to you, I don't know if you can see it there, but one of the first pieces of feedback I got from somebody when I shared that was that, wow, you have a lot of remotes. It was someone on the autism spectrum who they were zeroed in on the 10 remotes that were sitting beside me on the couch. So, but it's something that we use, lead off our presentations around the world with that video as a bit of an introduction to Jaden.
But it's an amazing video, and I suppose it really captivates the sort of journey that you've been on as a parent in terms of having a child with autism. How has that been? And furthermore, what sort of things do you think the sort of next stages for the globe, Canada in particular, can do towards helping children with autism and parents in particular dealing with also autistic children?
As we're dealing with developmental disabilities generally, so I get a chance to work with some pretty cool people, and we've been working with Tim Shriver on this. Of course, his mom founded Special Olympics, and then of course the Global Partnership in Education Cannot Wait. One of the things that I often think about is someone that cares about international development, and there are so many conservative governments around the world that have done such great work, including yours. And I think back to our government with Stephen Harper in 2010 with the Muskoka Initiative. But we think about the big issues that we're trying to deal with at that international level. And if you can build a system that goes into, we talk a lot about the hardest to reach or those left furthest behind. If we can build a system, particularly an education system, that finds people who are literally invisible to the system, they're hidden at home. The explanation oftentimes is that there's a curse on the child or whatever the case might be, and such huge stigma around it. If we can build a system that reaches out, finds them, and includes them in the hardest to reach places in the world, we're going to have a system that reaches everybody along the way. And so this has been a real focus for me. It seems to have a lot of traction. People can't always find common ground in every area that we work on as politicians, but this is an area that seems to be easy to find common ground on, and something that we can really build around with tangible impact. And one of the things that I often say, if we can not just see the challenges that people with autism or other developmental disabilities face, if we can also see their strengths and skills and abilities and include them to the level where we're more aware of those, our societies are just going to be better off across the board.
I mean, you touched on conservative governments there. We obviously have a conservative government in the UK in power at the moment. I know with Canada, it's been, if you like, a while now since we've seen a Conservative government. We had 9 years of Stephen Harper, and now we've had 6 years of Justin Trudeau's Liberal Party. How do you see the Conservative Party of Canada starting to look to win sort of a majority? As last election, you did begin to close the gap with Trudeau losing his majority, and that leads me also on to how do you feel Justin Trudeau's time as the country's prime minister has fared so far?
Those are big questions, actually. We could probably use the rest of our time with answers to those, but let's deal with the first one first, and that's our party and what a path to back to government looks like for us. In the last election, it's kind of interesting. In 2019, we actually got more votes than the Liberal Party got. So we got 6.3 million votes, and I think they were around 6.1 million. But our votes were very inefficiently distributed. We had a lot of votes in the West, in Alberta and Saskatchewan, two of our Western provinces. We have 48 of our seats, and we won 47 of them. But we lost a lot of close races in the East that in the past, when we formed government, we would have won in those seats. We have to figure out a way to find the common ground between the 6.3 million votes that we already have from the last election and about 1 to 1.5 million that we need to win in other parts of the country. And those are people who, for the most part, voted for Justin Trudeau in 2019 and 2015, for that matter. And we have to, devise policies that are going to find some common ground between those two. We can't just take a hard shift towards center or even center left. I think a lot of people who might not be in Canada might not realize Trudeau is probably by far the most left-leaning prime minister that we've ever had. And in many ways, in 2015, many would say that he jumped over the NDP, which is our traditional socialist party, to the left, that he was actually running a little left of them when he won. And so, we have to just make sure that as we move to find those votes that we need to win, that we find some common ground with our base. And I think there's lots of room to do that. Sensible environmental policy that finds a balance with our energy policy. Canada's a country rich in natural resources. And so we have a standard of a quality of life that we have because of those resources, and people around the world actually have quality of life because of resources found in countries like Canada. We have to find a way to extract those resources and use those resources to protect our quality of life at the same time, do so in a way that is, that respects the environment and helps us to tackle the significant challenges of climate change, around the world. And so I think that we can do that. And, there's an important conversation happening right now within our party in that regard, but it's going to take some work. How's Trudeau done on the fiscal side? So, it's interesting, since the 2019 election, most of the colleagues who are new since that election, we added about 20 colleagues in our party. We did gain seats. I've hardly met them. We've hardly sat in person. March 11th, the election was in October. It took a little while for the government to come back, and then we had our traditional Christmas break. So, and then March 11th, sort of Wednesday of that week in March, when Tom Hanks tested positive and the NBA shut down. It was all on the same day, and we've hardly seen each other. So everything's been about COVID, and I think that what he's done well is his government has struck a calming tone during COVID. Any governments around the world took measures to help people to be able to distance and follow guidelines. I think where the challenge is that we as a country have spent more money per capita than almost any other country, and we haven't had the best results. We didn't shut our borders down early enough, and that presented a real challenge for us. We're actually having that same conversation now with the variants, and again, we're slow to close our borders. There is a lot of conversation around vaccines and our inability to procure vaccines to the same level as the UK or the US or many other countries, particularly early on. They're coming now, but it's a little bit late because they trailed the variants coming in, and we're in a third wave that we probably didn't need to face, at least not to the extent that we're facing it right now. And the government just presented a budget, first budget in 2 years. And I think for a fiscal conservative taking a look at the budget, you can say that the COVID spending, people can understand the COVID spending in the context of what's happened. I would say $400 billion in a population that is about 38 million people. There needed to be more conversation as it was happening that spending wasn't just the government, quote unquote, having your backs. It was, money borrowed from future generations, trade-offs, necessary trade-offs, perhaps, for some future programs that you might have to tackle COVID right now. That would be an important framing. But the budget also projects significant deficits into the future, and spending that is over a 60% increase over 8 years of that they'll have been in government by 2023 if they're still in government, and that's post-COVID numbers. So program spending that has just been increasing at completely unsustainable rates. And I think there's going to be some fair criticism. The challenge we have, of course, right now is that we've got COVID in front of us, so we have to deal with that. Very, very important that we all deal with that. But we can't take our eye off the ball in regards to things that are going to impact generations. I look at this as a 1 or 2 generation issue, the amount of spending that we're undertaking.
Justin Trudeau here actually received quite a bit of criticism in the UK when, I'm not sure if you recall his speech about the UK being in a third wave or on the verge of a third wave. What sort of lessons do you think that the Conservative Party of Canada can learn from the 2019 election? And do you think there are certain challenges that you face in particular that we need to solve, if you like?
Absolutely. We lost an election in 2015 and then another election in 2019. And I think there's similar lessons from both, and there's different lessons from both. I'm not a huge fan of hardcore negative campaigning. You talk to people who've been in the business for a long time and they swear by it and say the reason people do it is because it works. I think that there are some better ways, and there are some examples of campaigns that have been successful where it hasn't been as negative. Certainly, criticizing your opponents when they've been in government for 2 terms, that would be fair game. But I think that we've got to be smarter in our criticisms, and more professional, I think, in our approach to it. In 2015, we had a prime minister who had been in power for almost a decade in Stephen Harper, and someone who was very well respected around the world. We had come through the global economic meltdown. He was trusted. Even opponents understood him to be very smart as a leader. And we, having that asset of that history, certainly a challenge of being 9-10 years. That's a time frame that's tough when you get to that point in your government. But we chose to run campaigns making fun of Trudeau's hair, and we chose a strategy focused very much on Trudeau. And I think the assumption was that he was a weak leader, and that we just had to point that out and we would win. I think it's fair game to say he has been a weak leader. But at the time, what we should have been running, in my mind, was movie trailer style ads showing our leader on the world stage with there were no end of quotes praising him for his work through the global meltdown, and then beyond that global meltdown, getting the budget back to balance by 2015. We were in a fantastic place economically, and I just think that we didn't run the right campaign there, communications wise. In 2019, we did wind up winning more seats, a significant number more seats than what we'd won in the previous election. So there were some successes to point to. But I do think that on the communications side, again, we got caught up in debates on social issues that hadn't been issues in Canada for us for a decade, things that we had resolved many years ago. And they wound up coming back and sort of bubbling up in the 2019 campaign, and we just weren't prepared to deal with them. And because of that, we just didn't get on top of it. And I think it had an impact in those seats that we talked about earlier, where we need to win. Out west, the oil and gas issues, the pipeline issues, the economic issues generally were really strong. But out east, we couldn't overcome that difficulty communicating on those tough social issues.
What was it like working in Stephen Harper's sort of government administration? And another question is there much difference that you find in your role from being in government versus out of government?
Yeah, so it was fantastic. I mean, quite honestly, I mentioned earlier that I think Stephen was one of the best leaders in the world during his time in office. I think particularly this audience will recognize that regardless of where in the world they are, he would be very well respected, and rightfully so. I personally think he's, the greatest prime minister during my lifetime, certainly, that Canada's had. There was a stability there, a professionalism. There was just you felt secure, as a country, and that we were really on a good path. I often quote John Wooden, one of my favorite quotes, and one of his sort of keys to success is to surround yourself with smart people who will argue with you. And I think as a government, I think the Prime Minister Harper did that. Our cabinet was full of very strong personalities, very smart people who were not afraid to speak up and encouraged to speak up. And interestingly, that's not his public persona. So publicly, and especially amongst the media and people who lean more towards the left, our opponents, they would argue that he was controlling and try to paint that picture. But that wasn't my experience on the inside. My experience on the inside was that he always knew his stuff, and if you were going to weigh in on something, you better be prepared for some pushback if you hadn't done your homework, because he always had. And but he did appreciate people who came forward with ideas, and we had some, we had better policy because of it. And I think we're missing that right now.
Obviously, it's not long now to go before the 2023 election. I know there's a lot of rumors circulating that the election could be quite a bit sooner than that. I think we saw Justin Trudeau change quite a bit of his cabinet earlier on this year, and many people are viewing that with a slight improvement in his approval ratings. That could hint towards an election potentially being this year. What are your thoughts on an early election, and how do you think the Conservative Party of Canada would react to the prospects of an early election?
We'll be ready. I mean, if we have an early election, we'll be as ready as anybody else, I think. There is substantial amongst a good portion of the population, there's substantial dissatisfaction with the work that Prime Minister Trudeau's done and how he's handled the pandemic. So in terms of raising money and volunteers who are fired up and energized, we'll be ready. I mean, of course, fighting election in the midst of a third wave would be challenging. So we'll see where things are at COVID wise. I think that if he was to call an election too early, this third wave, it would be seen as opportunistic, I think. But I do think that he probably, and there's probably a calculation within the cabinet that earlier is better, less time for Canadians and Parliament to sort of dig into the numbers around COVID and the accountability for the record levels of spending that occurred and the approach relative to other countries. But we're, you always have to be ready in a minority parliament, and our party's always done a good job of that. So we're prepared to go if we have to.
I mean, we're talking quite a bit about Justin Trudeau, and we had Michael Chong on our platform at the start of this year, and we discussed about him being a compassionate conservative, and one of the almost issues for conservative members of parliament, generally conservative people, is almost attacking Justin Trudeau, as he does have quite a strong, if you like, personal image. He does show and is a very empathetic person. Is that something that you're worried that the Conservative Party has a difficulty with dealing with? Because we had someone recently from the New Zealand National Party who talked a lot about Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, where they felt it's very hard for them to attack Jacinda Ardern, especially in a global pandemic where people would be almost craving for more sympathy as opposed to people on the offensive side of things. Is that something that is potentially an issue for the Conservative Party and members like yourself?
I think it's an issue for everybody in opposition right now. Is you don't want to be seen as being political and partisan in the context of a sort of need for everybody to come together. And Prime Minister Trudeau, he's done a good job on the empathy side. There's no question. Anybody that watches for the first several months coming out of the cottage, Parliament wasn't sitting. They'd shut down Parliament. And so being that reassuring voice coming out and doing his daily statement in the early days was a good look for them. That's continued. That type of messaging has continued as we've gotten into question period. But if you watch it, it's almost becomes mind numbing a little bit. This government has your backs is, I bet you 15 times every question period that phrase is used. The idea that we're in this together, and all of these things are, they're important. We are in this together, but that's not an answer. I mean, if we're going to get the best policy outcomes, you have to have a parliament functioning, which for 6 months in the early days of the pandemic, we didn't even have a properly functioning parliament. We basically had a glorified committee where some members went into the House of Commons and debated stuff. And I think on 4 or 6 or 8 occasions sat as a parliament to rush through some pandemic related legislation. We went 2 years without a budget. These are relevant concerns. It is, but it's a fine line, right? If your parliament is functioning and you're going hard at the government, you definitely don't want to be seen to being partisan. I would make the argument at the time, because those who advocated for the government's position of not having a parliament functioning, talked about the fact that we need to all be working together. I would argue that Canadians would hold opposition parties to account if we were too partisan, and it was way too important for our parliament to be, parliamentarians representing our constituents to be able to ask the government why we didn't have mass rapid testing development, or to find out where we were on rapid dependable testing development, to ask questions about the quarantine plan that came out towards the end of the year that came out as almost a rumor, a leak. People didn't actually believe it was serious, and then it wound up a couple months later being the plan. Talking about border closures and all of the different things that we need to do. And most importantly, at that time, we could have been asking, back in April and May and June of 2020, we could have been asking about vaccine procurement and really getting to the bottom of what was going on there, because the government had cut a deal with sort of a Chinese entity, Chinese Canadian entity, to procure vaccines that was clearly not going to produce anything. It seems that the government knew that, and yet we didn't have an ability or a venue to even ask questions. At one point in time in the summer, in August, there had been a scandal brewing with an organization called We for a couple of months, from June, July, and August, and there were committees looking into it. And really important, when you're talking about the amount of spending the government's doing, it's quite important for Parliament to be able to ask about that spending. It's not political, it's necessary. It's part of the accountability function. And right in the midst of that, the government made the decision to prorogue Parliament, which means basically that everything was shut down for 6 weeks until towards the end of September, when they did a throne speech. And not only did it shut down these committees that were looking, like the ethics committee looking into the WE scandal, but it shut down the Health Committee, for example, where they were, asking important questions about Canada's COVID response. Shutting down a committee studying your COVID response in the midst of, or just heading into the second wave, actually at the time, was completely counter to good public policy and a process to get the best results for Canadians.
So it's fair to say, do you think that COVID, they've almost been able to use COVID and what's going on with lockdown to almost avoid questioning from both the public and opposition?
Absolutely. I think that's very fair in the early days. I think that we face a challenge that many conservative governments have faced, and we've faced, our oppositions have faced, and we faced it when we were in opposition in the, in the late 90s and early 2000s as well, which is for whatever reason, the media pays more attention when left-leaning parties are in opposition, and they pay less attention when to the questions conservatives are asking. And somehow we've got to find a way to cut through that, because there are really important questions right now that can't be just brushed away with this government's got your backs. Significant questions about border closures right now at this point in time. That's a significant issue. The government has taken steps in recent days, but when they took similar steps back in the spring of 2020, they weren't followed through. And so I think there's some pretty important questions that have to be asked there. I think it's, on the vaccine front, we've got to find creative ways to highlight the fact that answers aren't coming in question period. Perhaps it's a little bit different than it used to be, where, question period was broadcast on CPAC, or, maybe shown a little bit on the news, but we didn't have social media around. In this day and age, when you don't get the answers in question period, you do have ways to pull them and cut them and show people that that's happening. But you got to be creative, hire more people in the sort of creative industries to make sure that they can do that. But as we do that, here's something that's really critical, is that there has to be truth in what we're saying. And too many political parties fall into the trap of not giving complete context to what they're trying to say. We have to make sure that we're capturing the actual context of what's being said or not being said in question period, and highlighting it fairly so that nobody can discount it. It's really, really important. And I think there's a big win coming for parties wherever they are in the political spectrum that can communicate in ways that people will trust. So make sure that you communicate, I think, take difficult concepts and can simplify them for people, but communicate them in a way that there's a little bit more context there than what we might have done in the past. Because I think people are longing for that right now, in this sort of era of misinformation and no-name accounts on Twitter. People are looking for credible sources of information, and we can be that for them more than we have in the past. So that's one avenue that we can take.
Social media is really interesting that you've mentioned there. I think you saying that the media almost has a bit more of a left-leaning bias is something that here in the UK we definitely probably would agree with as conservatives. But social media can be quite difficult for our party and our members and our members of parliament. Generally speaking, it's almost an acceptance that we lose on social media, especially on the Twitter world and Instagram. I think on Facebook, we tend to fare a bit better. But on Twitter and Instagram, there is a clear left-leaning bias and almost stronger hold of people there. How do you tackle that on social media? Because it is a difficult space. I'm sure you get a lot of criticism, and we are stuck in these sort of echo chambers. How do you manage actually giving out useful information on your social media accounts?
So first of all, I do all of my own social media. And if people go to my Twitter or Facebook or Instagram accounts, it means a couple of things. I mean, there's some downsides to it. I'm behind on Instagram. Instagram's a little bit tricky because you can't just fill it up with a whole bunch of screenshots of Zoom meetings you're on. It gets kind of boring. So, but on Instagram, in a general world, Instagram's a place where you gotta be a little bit more personal. I'm not a big fan of the throwing up graphic after graphic after graphic attacking the government, because I don't believe that people who are on Instagram that's what they're there for. Certainly sharing some of your personal story at the same time as just some sort of warmer posts of pictures when you're out and about on Instagram is a good strategy. I do think that it doesn't work for everybody. I mean, it clearly wouldn't work for a leader of a party to do their own Twitter and stuff, but for the right people, it adds a personal touch when you're doing it yourself. And so anybody that goes on my Twitter page knows that it's me. And I tend to focus a little bit more time there. And content, we've got to do a much better job on creating content that we can get out there. And I really do. I think there's a power for us to share personal stories. So, I'm very open about having a son with autism, and the fact that when I share his story, there's a lot of people out there that resonate with it. There's families who are looking for a champion, but there are a lot of people out there who want to see conservatives engaged in those kind of issues. And if you think about our caucus, we have 120 members of caucus. In addition to the very important work that we do on, immigration or justice or whatever it is, every one of us have things that are in our personal life that are life experiences that are relatable to people. And I think that we've got to do a better job of sort of dividing that up and taking on some of those issues using the platform we have, because it really does, number one, it most importantly makes a difference in people's lives, a meaningful difference in people's lives, but it also makes us more relatable to people who are going through similar things. And so I think sharing a little bit more personally is powerful. And then I would say the other thing is just, I think we've got to cut the edge off the tone. And I think this goes for not just parliamentarians, politicians. This goes for conservatives across the board. Here in Canada, there are a couple of names that you can sound a lot like Trudeau, that you can attach to him on social media, and they take off. And I ask people, if you're calling the prime minister a clear name on Twitter, you might get 1,000 retweets, but not one person who voted for Justin Trudeau is going to see that and go, oh, they're right, I'm going to vote conservative now. And so we really have to give some thought to the tone of our communications. And I encourage people, when they're communicating on social media, be respectful. You can be firm, you can be funny, but be truthful and be respectful. And, is what you're saying fair? Is it important? We just, as conservatives, I think we've got to take on a little bit of a different tone. And then then there's civility in politics just in general. And I think that as we kind of take a look at what's going on in the social media world, it's across the board bad for democracy. You've got people on both sides just bombarding the other side, and these echo chambers you talked about, like everybody is living in a complete echo chamber right now. And so you're, not only the people you follow wind up reinforcing everything you already believe, but the ads that you get reinforce it. The suggestions, the algorithms drive you to more of that. And we've gotten to a place where you can't have a debate anymore. You can't persuade anyone anymore. Because people have already made up their minds. And even in a regular conversation, people are spewing talking points at you. Just regular people are spewing, political talking points. And so you can't have a good political debate with somebody anymore. It's getting harder and harder, isn't it?
Definitely. I think I think that middle ground is very quickly evaporating. I think it's really difficult. I think anyone, I think on both sides, I feel we're probably more in the minority as conservatives on social media. And I think it is getting quite toxic, and there is almost like a yelling match going on, which brings me on to something that you've been doing really, really well. I was fortunate enough to be asked by you to attend one of your Zoom happy hours, and which I thoroughly enjoyed. Maybe you could tell our listeners and our viewers a bit more about that.
Yeah, it's it kind of spun out of I've been listening a lot to podcasts during the early days of the pandemic, and listening more and more to people like Dan Carlin, who admittedly in the US he leans more left, but a very thoughtful guy. He does a hardcore history podcast, and then does one called Common Sense. And listening to people like him and others lamenting this sort of political discourse and sort of where it's going. And then you saw the events down in the States during first the summer and then January 6th. And anyway, during all of that, we were as a team talking about, okay, how do we use the platform we have to start bringing people together and having conversations, so that the conversations aren't just happening over social media. So we have this cool network. After 15 years, a member of Parliament, especially in the world that I work in with the sort of international development work, and done a lot of that. We know some fantastic people from across the political spectrum, and we had this new, it wasn't new technology in Zoom, but the difference being that everybody actually knew how to use it now. And so this ability to bring people together who you might have waited for the UN General Assembly to see, or some conference you were going to, the Global Disability Summit in London that I went to a few years back, right? Those are great places to meet people, but now we can bring them together on Zoom. So we started saying, well, what if we had a, not just another roundtable meeting, because everybody has 15 roundtable meetings every day on Zoom. What if we had a social, kind of like a patio on Zoom? And so we started doing these Zoom happy hours on Fridays, closed group. It wasn't broadcast, 9 people, just grabbing a couple of drinks, 4 o'clock Eastern time till 5:30. We kind of got it down to a science, 90 minutes. You can't come late. You have to be on time because you don't want people coming in and out of the meeting. And we just go around the table, and we might have, you from the UK, and I might have David Moskrop, who's like a hard left writer here in Ottawa, but a reasonable guy. We've had Aaron O'Toole on before. We've had a lot of Harper era political staffers and colleagues of mine, people from the media, and we have just a great conversation every single time. We're up to about over 200 people in this Zoom happy hour universe, we call it. And it's just people who, what it comes down to? The label that's most important to them is human being before their party affiliation, or any of the multiple labels we want to attach to people all the time. Everybody just comes in with an open mind, and knowing that they're going to have a great conversation. And we have a do no harm rule, so you're not allowed to hurt anybody based on what you hear at it. And for an hour and a half, we have some of the best conversations you can imagine. I know that some of the people from those Zoom happy hours are tuning in today, but they've been fantastic. And every single time, people just walk away saying, this is what we've been longing for. So the challenge now is we've expanded it to 3 days a week. We do them Tuesday, Thursday, Friday now. Significant investment of time and staff time to coordinate. But the hope is we've had many of the folks that have come out are doing their own now. And so it's creating a little bit of a ripple effect, but we're trying to figure out where do we go from here. We've done one on a podcast that runs here in Canada, a political podcast. So we did a mini version of one there, but they're fantastic.
Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed it when I attended. It's a really good mix of people, and a very engaging, almost like a safe zone where you can talk about your beliefs and opinions, and you're not on Twitter fearful of being attacked left, right, and center. So it was a really enjoyable experience. Would you say it almost was also born from something that you've spoken about in the past before with this sort of political discourse? Would you say that had an impact?
Oh, absolutely. It was such a big part of it. And I've got a video. I did a 1-minute statement in the House of Commons about, I guess, a couple months ago. And I can share my screen. I'll show that too, because I put some effort into it and captured what it is that I would want to say. So I'll play that for you here. And then we can talk about that a little bit.
Mr. Speaker, the past several years have been challenging for global democracy. We've seen a rise in polarization and increasingly vitriolic language expressed by hyper-partisans from all sides. Too often this leads to violence. Social media has exacerbated the problem. Sides are chosen and anchored in Twitter bios. Talking points are delivered in echo chambers, amplified by cryptic algorithms. 6 decades ago, President Dwight Eisenhower seemingly anticipated our current need for wisdom, saying, quote, "The middle of the road is all of the usable surface. The extremes, right and left, are in the gutters." Mr. Speaker, before our political labels, we are all just human beings. The middle of the road is simply our common ground. Make no mistake, passionate political debate is foundational to a healthy democracy, but it's most effective when we engage in conversations not only seeking to persuade, but open to being persuaded. This will require a significant shift in our current thinking, but in the end, we'll all be better off for it.
So, so that was from a couple of months ago, and that got a little bit of coverage. I did some media around that as well. We have this, again, I talk about that platform we have, and I love those words from Eisenhower so many years ago, Republican president who, and remember, finding that the middle of the road, I guess, in a sense, it's not necessarily talking about just policy. It's talking about kind of finding common ground, right? And how often these days are we actually seeking to find that common ground with people who come from a different political party? We spend all of our time, it seems like we spend all of our time on all sides, focused on the things that divide us. And so when someone has an idea, our first instinct is to have meetings and policy and issues people go in and find out why that idea is terrible, if that idea comes from the other side. And again, I've said this before, I think as a movement, as a party, certainly here in Canada and in the US and in the UK, countries that I'm more familiar with, I believe there's a big political win for us if we can get there, find that type of approach, because that's where people are right now. They're looking for that. They're tired of the noise. We see it. It doesn't feel like they're tired of the noise when we're on Twitter. But I think that the regular person on Twitter, the regular person on Facebook, they're just sick of their timelines being filled with angry politics. They want something a little bit different.
I think that video you shared there, I remember watching it and thinking that was very well said, and it's something that in this country we regularly talk a lot about. I think for us, the thing that's very popular in our country is our sort of pub culture, and I think having those conversations in pubs in an almost open and free environment has been a great thing. And I think social media is almost, in some ways, for a lot of us here in the UK, it's really putting us all in these sort of boxes. And I think when we then hear people who think differently to us, we feel a bit agitated, and we feel we don't feel as comfortable in that environment. Whereas in sort of general pub culture, you're forced to be around people who are different to you, and you kind of adapt to it, and you share some great ideas and you learn different things. So it's that video really resonates well, and I'm sure it resonated well with a lot of our listeners. I suppose that leads me on to your experiences in the UK and London. I know you visited it a few times, and I'm sure you've got a few interesting stories to tell us.
I have to say, I love the city. I've probably been there, I don't know, 5 or 6 times. Haven't had the chance to travel much beyond London. Normally when I'm there, it's for a purpose, and I usually try and extend a little bit. Oftentimes when I'm staying there, I stay at a hostel. And I had never stayed at a hostel when I was younger. It's something that I've only done when I was older. There's a place called Wombats, which is about 5 minutes walk from the Tower Bridge. But just that area is absolutely mesmerizing to me. When I walk around, you see the Shard, and I know everybody either loves or hates the Shard, but some of the markets, Camden Market, and getting up there, and the market, there's a market right downtown, right by the river there. I can't remember which
Borough
one.
Market, maybe?
Yeah. Borough Market. Oh my gosh, what a fantastic experience to be able to walk through there and around the streets. It's kind of funny. My first time, I actually went there to escape. Just I needed a couple of weeks off. I think it was not that far after the 2015 election, and I stayed at this Wombats hostel. And I was just traveling by myself, and I was just so looking forward to just getting away from places where anybody knew me. And the very first night, I was in the pub downstairs in the hostel, and heard some guy talk, and it was people talking pretty loud, a lot of people down there, and all of a sudden I heard the word Edmonton, and of course I looked over and waited a few seconds and thought, should I say anything? And I did. I asked him about it, and then the second I turned to him and said, "Did you say Edmonton?" He turned to me and goes, "You're Mike Lake." my brother worked on your campaign. So much for the anonymity of traveling by myself and getting away from it all. So, and he'd had a few drinks. So he subsequently announced to everybody in the pub that I was Mike Lake, a Canadian member of Parliament. So it's as much as you think that you can get away and escape, it's kind of hard in the world we're in. But I love London. It's one of my favorite cities in the world. So, and I hope to. I have a friend who did a walk across the sort of northern region of the country. I guess there's like I think it was a 13-day walk from one coast to the other, staying in bed and breakfast and stuff. And that's something through the Lake District. So something that I'd love to do at some point in time too.
Definitely. Well, I'm sure next time you are able to come to London, we can maybe do this event in person, and we tend to host our events in the House of Commons, so that'll be a good fun experience. I'm going to take one quick question from our audience. It's from Charlie, who is a regular viewer of our podcasts. He said he'd like to ask about your autism advocacy work. He's proud and happy that you're supporting autism causes, especially for his son Jaden. He himself is autistic, Charlie, and is involved in frontline politics. He was asking, would you like to see more people with autism supporting Conservatives and being more involved in frontline Conservative Party activities?
I would. I have a girl with autism working in my office right now, employed part-time. She actually has 4 jobs, and one of them is working in my office, which is inspiring. Absolutely want to see people with autism finding a home in the Conservative Party. But I want to make sure that the reason that they find a home is because they see us doing the right thing, making sure that we're focused on unlocking potential and creating opportunities for people with autism around the world to fulfill that potential, and not just autism. I mean, I think that the conservative DNA is that we want to create opportunities for everybody. We see the potential in every human being to contribute. I talk a lot about it when I talk about Jaden. I talk about moving from inclusion, which is really, really important, to contribution, because my goal for Jaden isn't that he's just included in things. My goal for Jaden is that he is able to, because he's so happy when he's contributing. And that's my goal for him, is that he's able to find a place, maybe working in a public library or something like that, where he's able to contribute to the fullness of his skills and abilities. And again, I think that that's something that applies for every human being. And if we as Conservatives champion that and embrace that, we're on the right path.
I suppose that leads me on to, do you think it's harder for people who have, let's just say, learning difficulties or with autism, or I suppose generally ethnic minorities, women, to be Conservative? Because there is this sort of stigma that we have in the UK, especially. I mean, there was a massive change in the 2019 election, where we had almost record amounts of different ethnic minorities, women coming forward for the Conservative Party in the UK. But prior to that, there was generally a bit of a stigma in our country between those kind of profile of people openly saying that they're supportive. And I think one of the great things with Charlie is he is very very vocal about his Conservative support, his support for the party. Is that an issue you kind of see in Canada? And what more could we do as Conservatives, if you like, to make it more friendly for people who, let's say, who do suffer autism or who are not typically men, to be more pro-Conservative and voice it?
Yeah, I would say our parties, here in Canada and around the world, absolutely need to reflect our electorate, and we don't. In almost anywhere do we reflect our electorate to the extent that we ought to. And I think our party is taking that very seriously here, and not with not through tokenism, not through meaningless policies that are, that have some label attached to them to, as a marketing exercise, reach groups of people, but rather policies that are, going to make a difference in their lives. So we've got to make sure that we have common sense immigration policy that brings in new Canadians who are going to be able to succeed and contribute to our country. We need to make sure that we've got common sense economic policy, fiscal policy, because the vast majority of new Canadians, immigrants to Canada, are coming here ready to work. They're coming here wanting to create a better life for their family. And as conservatives, we can create policy that's going to have a positive impact for everybody without attaching a label to it. And people will gravitate towards those policies. But then we absolutely do need to ensure that as we're recruiting candidates and going out there and encouraging people to get involved in campaigns and join our boards, that we're building a team of people who, again, reflect society. And a couple of reasons for that. It's not just about the way that it looks or the optics of it. It's the fact that we're going to be better as a party when we have more people coming from different perspectives who are part of the conversations at our policy conventions and our board meetings, and even as we're running campaigns. And so diversity of ideas is a good thing. Diversity of life experiences is a good thing. And you can apply that in almost all categories. Here, we're seeing a real move within our party. We're seeing a real increasing connection, I think, with the LGBTQ community. People who are fiscal conservatives, who for a variety of reasons haven't been comfortable supporting us in the past, but are more comfortable now. And these are I think that's a really, really important question, Sunil, and something that we all need to keep in mind as we're talking to people and communicating with people.
Right, well, it's been great talking to you, Mike. I really enjoyed this conversation. I'm sure our listeners have too. It's been amazing having you back on our platform, and hopefully we can have you again soon, and hopefully next time it'll actually be in person. But no, it's been thoroughly enjoyable, and I want to let our listeners and viewers know this will be out shortly on our various different streaming platforms: YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, and yeah, thank you for tuning in and listening. And once again, thank you, Mike, for your time.
Yeah, no, Sunil, I really appreciate it. It's been great working with you leading up to this. And if people do want to reach out with feedback or thoughts, whatever the case is, my social media handles are just at Mike Lake MP. I've got a good political name, fits nicely on a sign and a handle. So just at Mike Lake MP for Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And I'm glad to be great to connect with people. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you all.